When you imagine the Amazon rainforest, what comes to mind? Perhaps it's the rustling canopy of green stretching endlessly to the horizon, or the river winding like a silver thread through the thick foliage. But beneath this grand expanse lies something less photographed, less studied, and infinitely more mysterious: the small, uneventful routines of its people. And among these quiet traditions lies an odd curiosity: the dreamstones of the Yawanawá tribe. The Yawanawá people, nestled deep in the western corner of Brazil's Acre State, have lived in relative isolation for generations. Not warriors in the grand historical sense, not empire builders or conquerors, but caretakers of a world often invisible to outsiders. Their world is one of songs, leaves, and the slow rhythm of sleep, a rhythm so central to life that it carries both practical and spiritual weight. The story begins with stones not large, ornate ones, but simple, river washed pebbles, slightly warm to the touch, often flat, and passed down between generations without much fanfare. These stones, the Yawanawá say, help with dreaming, not in a dramatic vision quest sense, but rather in guiding restful, untroubled sleep. They call them Kanehunu in their language, roughly translated, the stones of calm. Children are introduced to these dream stones as early as their first solo naps in the forest hammocks. These hammocks, suspended between trees in clearings where the sun filters through in warm rays, cradle the sleeping child like a cocoon. A stone is slipped beneath the hammock or sometimes tied inside it, swaddled in cotton or palm fiber, nearly forgotten, but always there. The origin of the Kanehunu is not traced to a single elder or shaman, nor to a myth or dramatic moment in the tribe's history. That's part of the charm. These stones don't come with a loud story. They've simply always been around, gathered from specific parts of the riverbank, known only to the women who collect them. Often, the same family returns to the same bend in the river for generations. It's believed that these stones carry the spirit of quiet places, the hush of the river, the stillness of dusk, the peace of the forest at night. It might seem like just a superstition, and perhaps in many ways it is, but what makes the dream stones intriguing is how methodically they're treated, cleaned with cassava water, wrapped in leaves during thunderstorms, not placed near cooking fires, and always kept out of sight of aggressive birds, especially the green-throated parrot. The rules are many, and none are questioned. There's no central doctrine here, no holy book or written rules, but the behaviors around the stones are consistent, bordering on ritual. Sleep itself becomes a kind of ceremonial act, not just an escape from the day's labor, but a place to receive messages, to align the inner reign, as one elder once explained to an anthropologist. Western researchers first noted the stones in the 1970s, though even then, they were dismissed as quaint folklore. A handful of ethnobotanists from Rio de Janeiro and European universities passed through Yawanawá lands, often more interested in medicinal plants than stones. But in a scattered notebook, now tucked in a library basement in Geneva, an anthropologist named Marta von Kessel recorded an observation that was quickly forgotten. These stones are not worshipped. They are respected. There is a difference. Though I cannot explain it well in Portuguese or English, it is like respecting silence itself. The connection between silence and the stones is an important one. In Yawanawá tradition, children are not told to be quiet as a form of discipline. Rather, Silence is introduced like a skill, something one grows into, something that, when mastered, allows you to hear the forest's voice more clearly. The stones, placed under sleeping heads or beneath forest hammocks, are said to help children hear without sound, to remember the silence of the earth during sleep. Sleep, in this community, is not a nuisance or unproductive downtime. It is an active part of living, a space where dreams are remembered with precision, not because they are prophetic or epic, but because they carry the flavor of a person's state of mind. One old woman named Mosquito was known to keep small dream journals in the form of carved bark symbols. These carvings, read only by her daughters, reflected not the dreams themselves, but the patterns of emotion felt during sleep calm, anxious, floating, shadowed. Every dry season, as the rivers recede and new stones are exposed, a quiet harvesting ritual occurs. No drums, no painted faces, just a walk to the riverside. Women and girls wading in up to their ankles, slowly feeling through the silt and gravel. Stones are not chosen for beauty or symmetry. Some are dull gray, others flecked with moss or sediment. The only rule is this: if a stone makes your fingertips feel warm, just barely warmer than the air around you, it might be ready. The idea of readiness in stone choosing is not metaphorical. It's as literal as any touch based selection might be. The hand, trained by years of subtle contact with the forest world, knows what to trust. And sometimes the stones are returned to the river without explanation. Too heavy, too cold, or simply wrong in that way. The Yawanawá never try to articulate. No analysis, just a quiet nod and a release back into the current. What's curious is that these stones, though so gently revered, are never given center stage in community ceremonies. They're kept in gourds, wrapped in fiber, tucked inside hammocks, or under thatched roofs, rarely spoken of directly. You might only hear about them if you ask, and even then, the stories will be delivered with a shrug, a glance at the sky, or a slow sip of a drink. There is no desire to mystify them. Still, some outside observers have become mildly obsessed. A few NGOs have tried to collect and analyze the stones, seeking mineral content, electromagnetic properties, or even sleep enhancing vibrations. Nothing unusual has ever been found. They're just stones, and yet, to the Yawanawá, they are part of a broader sleep culture where dreaming is a daily act of remembering the forest. In the modern world, with its loud devices and hurried sleep, this concept feels alien. Could sleep be more than rest? Could it be a time of alignment, of unspoken learning? And why, in a world so full of distractions, would a people place such value on something so profoundly quiet? You might imagine that in a place as vibrant and alive as the Amazon rainforest, there would be no room for stillness. But if you were to walk quietly through the Yawanawá village in the early afternoon, you'd find something unexpected. Nearly everyone is asleep. Children nap, swaying gently in hammocks beneath thatched roofs. Elders lie in woven slings tied between trees, shaded by broad banana leaves. Even the dogs doze in dappled sunlight. The entire village hums with a kind of restful silence, broken only by the soft thrum of cicadas and the whisper of leaves shifting in the breeze. This afternoon napping tradition is not laziness, nor simply a response to heat. It's a cultural rhythm deeply tied to the Yawanawa's beliefs about health, dreams, and the body's balance with the forest. In their worldview, sleep is not a state of inactivity. It is a moment of communication with one's inner self, with the trees, and occasionally with the spirits that live in the canopy. And this daily nap, so consistent it could be mistaken for ritual, is guided not only by timing, but by environment. Hammocks are hung in precise locations between specific trees known for their calming presence. The Yawanawá have long claimed that certain trees sing slower, meaning they produce a field of calm energy suitable for rest. The Urucuri palm is particularly favored. While Western science has found no measurable difference in these trees, the Yawanawá insist that you can feel it in your bones, an inexplicable sensation of groundedness. The hammocks themselves are hand woven from fibers of the buriti palm, dyed with natural pigments, often passed down from mother to daughter. Some hammocks are decades old, repaired again and again, with patches sewn not just for function, but as records of family events. One patch might mark the birth of a child, another, the first time a daughter successfully hunted her own fish. Sleep, you see, carries memory here, not just in the mind, but in the objects that cradle it. Visitors often ask whether the dreamstones are used during these naps. The answer is yes, though not always in the same way as during night sleep. For naps, the stones are sometimes placed in small pouches worn against the chest. Some women will even chew certain leaves mildly bitter and calming before tucking the stone pouch under the hammock's edge. This is not to induce sleep faster, but to make the quality of that sleep more open, as they describe it. So your body breathes with the forest, one elder put it, tapping her chest slowly. Interestingly, dreaming itself is not the ultimate goal. Many naps pass dreamlessly. That's considered fine. But on those rare days when a nap brings a strong dream, a color that won't leave your mind, or the sound of an animal long dead, that dream may be shared later. After supper, in a slow, round table sort of conversation, not publicly, not loudly, more like passing a folded note under the table, brief, gentle, and with no pressure to interpret. Some anthropologists have suggested that this practice helped reduce stress or encourage community bonding. Perhaps, but for the Yawanawá, it's simpler than that. Dreams are part of the forest. You wake up with leaves still rustling in your memory. Nowhere is this more evident than during the time of the long sleep, a rare event held once every few years in the dry season, when weather is calm and the river runs low. During this event, the entire adult population of the village engages in a 3-day cycle of extended rest, not quite fasting, but with minimal food, minimal speaking, and an extended series of naps interspersed with gentle activity. It's not enforced, and children are only included if they ask. The idea behind the long sleep is alignment not with celestial bodies or metaphysical calendars, but with the tempo of the forest itself. In a world without clocks, the Yawanawá rely on patterns of bird calls, shadow length, and tree scent to tell time. The long sleep allows the body to recalibrate, to slow down and fall back in sync with the environment. It is during these 3 days that dreamstones are most widely used, often borrowed from other families, creating a quiet network of shared calm. An outsider watching might assume nothing important is happening. People are lying down. Occasionally, someone stirs and drinks from a calabash bowl. Birds call from overhead. The dogs chase insects lazily. But beneath this stillness is a discipline of rest rarely found in other cultures. There's no guilt, no productivity anxiety, no self help slogans about optimizing your sleep cycle, only the understanding that without rest, there is no clarity, and without clarity, there is no strength. Occasionally, a child will be chosen to lead a nap. This is not an honor in the usual sense. There is no applause, but it is significant. The chosen child walks slowly between the trees, humming a soft song, a tune passed down without lyrics. The child then chooses the spot where the adults will nap that day. If the child chooses well, everyone sleeps soundly. If not, there are no reprimands, just murmurs that perhaps the child is still learning. It is a practice in observation, in trust, and in the subtle ways that leadership is cultivated without hierarchy. This communal restfulness has also influenced how the Yawanawá approach conflict. Arguments are rarely addressed immediately. If a disagreement arises, the common wisdom is to sleep on it, not metaphorically, but literally. Each party will return to their hammocks, sometimes with dream stones warmed in the sun. They lie down, they sleep, they listen to the night. Only the next day, sometimes 2 days later, is the matter addressed. More often than not, it resolves itself in silence. There's an old saying among the Yawanawá: the trees don't yell, meaning if the forest can solve its problems quietly, so can you. Sleep here is not an escape, but a return, not a surrender, but a rebalancing. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is how little any of this has changed in the modern era. Despite the slow creep of roads, radio signals, and missionary visits, the sleep traditions have endured. The dreamstones are still passed down. The hammocks still swing between carefully chosen trees. The long sleep still brings silence to the village. It raises a curious question. What would happen if other parts of the world treated sleep not as a necessary interruption, but as a place of learning and return? If a nap became a cultural tool rather than a stolen luxury? And what, if anything, do the stones remember? When the dreams have long passed, the forest forgets nothing. That's what the Yawanawá elders say, usually in low tones. When asked about change, the trees, the rivers, the stones they watch, they absorb, and while they do not speak in human voices, they hold memories, sometimes warm, sometimes heavy. The dream stones, simple as they are, belong to this silent archive. In recent decades, outside influences have reached even the quiet corners of the rainforest. Missionaries have come and gone, bearing books instead of hammocks. Government officials have mapped territories with pens and lines that the Yawanawá never drew. Schoolhouses have appeared with lessons in Portuguese, geography, and a growing focus on national identity. For a while, the stones nearly vanished. Younger generations, drawn to cities for schooling or opportunities, found the old sleep traditions quaint, even embarrassing. Stories about tree whispers and warmth-finding rituals didn't fit into the textbooks. Dream sharing began to feel childish. The hammocks of dyed buriti fiber were swapped for nylon, imported from afar. The forest nap began to shrink, not in time, but in trust. It was around this time, in the early 2000s, that an unusual return occurred. A young Yawanawá woman named Tashka, raised partly outside the village and educated in urban Brazil, came back not just to visit, but to stay. She wasn't old by tribal standards, but she brought with her a different kind of memory, one shaped by both satellite TV and ancestral stories whispered at dusk. What Toshka did wasn't dramatic. No grand speeches, no painted rituals. She simply began to ask questions, especially about the dream stones. She visited the elders, most of whom were now rarely speaking their full ceremonial language, and asked where the stones had come from. She wrote down everything they said. She sketched river bends, noted seasons, and mapped which trees the hammocks used to hang between. Then, one afternoon, she brought the children out to the river's edge, not to teach, but to look. They walked ankle deep in the same current their great grandmothers had walked, and when a girl named Mayani knelt and pulled a flat, lichen speckled stone from the water, no one told her whether it was the right one, but the moment she said it felt warm. The elders nodded, a small nod, but filled with meaning. Toshka's quiet revival of the stone traditions spread slowly, not through any official program, but through afternoon naps. She taught the children the old lullaby hums, not with lyrics, but by tone. She showed them how to wrap stones in fiber, how to dry them in the morning sun, how to listen to the hammocks sway. Over time, the hammocks returned not the imported ones, but the heavy, hand-woven kind that take weeks to finish and smell faintly of rain. The napping places were chosen more carefully again. Even the long sleep, nearly forgotten, was observed once more tentatively at first, but then with growing participation, elders smiled softly when they saw dream stones in use again, not because they believed the old world could fully return, but because part of it had chosen not to leave. What's fascinating is that in conversations with anthropologists, many of the younger Yawanawá no longer talk about the stones as spiritual. Instead, they refer to them as slow medicine, not medicine in the pharmaceutical sense, but something that heals by being present. They describe the stones as reminders to rest, to listen, to sleep without urgency. In a way, they are talismans not of power, but of permission. Western sleep scientists, upon hearing these accounts, often try to quantify the effect. Could these stones emit infrared warmth? Do they stimulate pressure points? Might the belief in them reduce cortisol levels? But perhaps such analysis misses the point, because the stones are not effective in and of themselves. They are effective within the system that holds them: the forest, the hammock, the silence, the belief that sleep is a sacred act of alignment. Today, a few of these dreamstones have traveled beyond the rainforest. Some sit in the drawers of anthropologists, others on the windowsills of those who once visited the village. One was reportedly gifted to a sleep researcher in Sao Paulo who kept it in her lab, though she confessed she never quite knew what to do with it. But the heart of the tradition remains in the forest. At night, when the cicadas begin their long song and the air cools just slightly, the village once again becomes quiet. One by one, hammocks fill. Some people sleep under stars, others beneath thatch. A few children still whisper until their breath slows, and under some of those hammocks, carefully wrapped in fiber or leaves, a small, unremarkable stone rests quietly. It is not magical, it is not rare, but it is deeply known, because in that stone is a memory of rivers running smooth, of mothers humming in the dusk, of naps between the same trees for generations. It holds the silence of those who never needed to shout to be remembered. And perhaps, in a world obsessed with speed and noise, That silence is more valuable than we realize. So the question remains, if we slept like the forest slowly, quietly, in rhythm with the world around us, what else might we finally begin to hear? There's an art to sleeping in the Amazon that most people will never learn, not because it's hidden or forbidden, but because it's slow, too slow for most modern travelers. But if you were to pause in the middle of a jungle clearing, somewhere between the chirp of a glass frog and the sleepy buzz of distant cicadas, you might just notice it. The invisible architecture of sleep, woven not from bricks or walls, but from banana leaves, smoke trails, and habit. In this story, we turn our attention away from dreamstones and towards something more ordinary, yet just as vital, the physical construction of sleep. Not dreams, not rituals, but the logistics, because even in a forest full of predators, storms, and biting insects, people have always found a way to sleep. The Amazon is not forgiving. Nights are wet. The ground is alive ants, centipedes, frogs, and unseen roots that twist like sleeping snakes. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds, their hums as constant as breathing. Yet for centuries, human beings, tribes from the Kayapo to the Tucano to the Matses, have built temporary shelters, small safe nests in which to rest their bodies and fall asleep. The foundation of these sleeping sites is rarely the ground. The forest floor is avoided whenever possible. Too damp, too crowded, too vulnerable. Instead, the bed begins in the air with the hammock. Nearly every tribe in the Amazon region developed some version of this tool. It's portable, breathable, and, perhaps most importantly, it swings an echo of the body's natural sleep rhythms. These hammocks are not luxury items. They're essential gear. They're crafted from vines, barks, or palm fibers like tucum or buriti. The choice of material varies by region, but the process is long and deliberate. Strips are dried in the sun, twisted into cords, and knotted with mind numbing repetition until the weave begins to hold its own shape. Some hammocks are dyed with crushed jenipapo fruit or anato seeds, not for aesthetics alone, but for protection. These natural dyes carry scents that deter insects or add mild antifungal properties. Others are left undyed, especially those for newborns, whose scent must not be masked. According to some beliefs, so the forest spirits can recognize them. But a hammock alone is not enough. The real craft of sleeping in the Amazon lies in what surrounds the hammock: invisible walls made of smoke, leaves, silence, and careful placement. First, the smoke. Fires are rarely left burning high. Instead, they're allowed to smolder. The thin columns of smoke drift upward, warding off mosquitoes without overwhelming the sleeper. Some tribes position two small fires on either side of the hammock, creating a protective corridor of warm air and smoke. The scent of certain burned barks, like copaiba or andiroba, adds further deterrent effects. Next, the leaves. Banana leaves in particular play an oversized role. These large, pliable sheets are cut and laid around the sleeping site, sometimes above, as makeshift roofing, sometimes beneath, to block dampness. But more interestingly, sometimes they're tied loosely around the hammock, like curtains not touching, just near enough to trick insects into bumping the leaf and retreating. Some leaves even have scents that are mildly repellent on their own, and sleeping within their perimeter is considered cleaner, safer Then there's the orientation of the sleep site. This may seem like a minor detail, but it's not. Most hammocks are tied east-west, with sleepers facing the rising or setting sun. This orientation is not symbolic, it's practical. It avoids direct moonlight, which is believed by some tribes to disturb the sleep of children or attract certain insects. Wind direction is also considered. A well situated sleeping spot catches the soft breeze that discourages mosquitoes, but avoids drafts that might chill the body during the early morning fog. And then there are the nets. Mosquito nets, as we know them today, fine mesh, synthetic fiber, packaged in plastic, are a relatively recent invention. But the idea of a sleeping barrier is ancient. Tribes have long used woven vines, layered leaves, or even carefully arranged smoke patterns to mimic the effect. In some cases, people sleep in pairs under a shared layer of cloth or bark, tucked in from all sides, breathing each other's warmth. It's not just protection from insects. The night carries other dangers. Snakes slithering near warmth, curious jaguars, or just the chill of unexpected storms. This is why many jungle dwellers do not sleep fully. They sleep in cycles lightly, waking often, listening between dreams. Sleep is segmented, not continuous. A few hours after dusk, then waking briefly to tend a fire, then another nap before dawn. This pattern, though seemingly inefficient, has persisted for centuries. Interestingly, this segmented sleep aligns with what some historians believe was common even in pre-industrial Europe. First sleep, then waking, then second sleep. In the Amazon, this rhythm is not a response to electricity, but to the jungle itself. The forest demands light. Sleepers, people who can awaken at the crunch of a leaf or the distant snap of a branch. And what about dreams? Though not always the focus, dreams are still considered part of this architecture. In some communities, people choose sleeping locations based on where they had good dreams in the past. A particular spot beside a certain tree might be used repeatedly, not because it's physically superior, but because it seems to offer dream calm. One elder of the Takuna people once said, "If I dream badly 3 nights in a row, I change trees. It's as straightforward as moving apartments, except the rent is paid in silence and leaf shade." These practices, taken together, form a kind of invisible architecture, one not made of bricks, but built just as carefully. It protects sleepers not only from physical harm, but from disorientation, because to live in the rainforest and sleep well is not a given. It is a skill, one passed from grandmother to child, from hunter to apprentice, over countless evenings of whispered advice and quiet adjustments. Imagine, for a moment, building your bed each night from scratch, not with sheets and a mattress, but with vines, smoke, wind, and sky. Would you sleep better, or would you lie awake, alert to every rustle, relearning what it means to trust the dark? And what would it mean to sleep not inside a home, but within a forest that listens? To sleep in the Amazon is to enter into a quiet negotiation with the forest, not a one-time deal, but a nightly pact. You may lie down here, among the roots and under the stars, but only if you remember the rules. The trees do not write them down. The insects do not announce them, but they are enforced all the same. The seasoned sleepers of the rainforest, the elders, the hunters, the midwives who walk barefoot beneath moonlight, know these rules intimately, not because they were taught in school, but because each rule came through discomfort. A sting here, a damp chill there, a restless night, followed by a better choice. The next one. This is how jungle sleep is learned by trial, by texture, by listening to the consequences of rest. One of the first things any child learns is how to read the ants, not to avoid them, though that is certainly part of the wisdom, but to understand their rhythm. Some ant species march relentlessly through the night, forming highways that cut through sleeping areas. Others nest under roots or in fallen logs. The worst, the fire ants, move in silent tides and sting without pause. If your sleeping site is near an ant trail, you will not sleep. You will shift and wake and itch. And so the forest children learn to trace the lines before dusk, to walk the perimeter of a nap zone, and mark the ground with crushed leaves that redirect the ants elsewhere. These aren't just survival skills, they are habits so deeply ingrained that they form part of the psychology of rest. You cannot relax until you've ensured that the ground itself agrees with you. Then comes the question of smoke. Earlier, we touched on its role as a barrier, but its importance runs deeper. The way smoke curls and settles can reveal the mood of the forest. On still nights, it rises straight and disappears. On agitated nights, it circles low, caught in unseen pockets of air. Some elders believe that strange smoke movement is a warning of nearby animals, of shifts in the spirits, or simply of unsettled ground. This might seem like superstition, but there's a physiological layer beneath it. Studies have shown that the scent and warmth of slow burning wood smoke can lower heart rates, quiet breathing, and even mimic the chemical signals of drowsiness. In forest terms, smoke is not just a shield, it is the first blanket. But protection is only one part of sleep. The other is familiarity. Most jungle dwellers do not sleep well in unfamiliar spots. Even if the hammock is identical, the air is not. The wind hits the skin differently. The frogs sing in unfamiliar tones. The darkness is too loud or too quiet. This sensitivity to place creates a kind of sleep cartography, a map of personal rest zones, known only to each sleeper. An elder may choose to nap in a different tree every afternoon, but always return to the same one when ill. A hunter might build 10 campsites in a year, but sleep best in just 2. These preferences are rarely explained. They are felt. That tree dreams slowly, one man said when asked why he avoided a certain branch. Not scary, just wrong. The jungle encourages this kind of attentiveness. It punishes inattention. A misjudged branch might snap. A poorly tied hammock might spill. A forgotten fire might smolder too close and singe the edge of the sleeping cloth. And so, slowly, over years, a person builds their own system, not of architecture, but of adaptation. Women in many tribes have their own sleep customs distinct from the men. During pregnancy, some switch to hammock styles that lie lower to the ground, not for ease, but because they believe the baby listens better when closer to the earth. Others sleep under trees with red flowers, thought to bring calmness or strength. These choices are not dictated by medicine, but by ancestral memory. You follow them not because they are proven, but because they worked for your grandmother and her mother and the long line before them. In some communities, sleepers carry a small night bundle, a palm leaf pouch that holds a few personal sleep tools, a scrap of bark with calming scent, a charm from an elder, a folded mosquito net. and sometimes a tightly wrapped piece of charred wood, not for warmth, not for use, just as a piece of yesterday's fire, something to link today's sleep to the last one. This bundle is placed near the head or tied to the hammock edge. If lost, it is remade, but always with some trace of continuity. Even the dogs, the half-wild jungle mutts that roam between huts and trails, know how to sleep smart. They curl beside smoke trails, dig shallow pits to escape humidity, or climb atop raised roots to avoid insects. No one teaches them. They learn the same way the people do, by mistake, and then by memory. The psychology of sleeping wild is, in many ways, the opposite of modern sleep science. In the jungle, there is no promise of complete darkness, no silence, no temperature control. There is only constant dialogue with the air, the ground, the creatures nearby. The body doesn't shut off. It adjusts. It listens while sleeping. Light sleep is not a problem here. It is the norm. And in this context, it is protective. Still, there is comfort to be found. A properly tied hammock, a well-placed smoke fire, a nap that follows the afternoon rain. These things create safety, not the safety of doors and locks, but the deeper safety of knowing that nothing in the forest is truly still, and yet you are allowed to rest within it. It's a strange kind of wisdom, that sleep need not be perfect to be good, that rest is not absence, but agreement. You give yourself to the forest for a few hours, and it holds you gently, but with rules. So tonight, when the crickets sing too loud or the bed feels unfamiliar, consider this. In the heart of the jungle, people sleep without certainty, without silence, without beds, and yet, somehow, they wake. Could it be that the best sleep is not the deepest, but the one where you feel safest, even if the only walls around you are made of leaves and drifting smoke? The forest does not ask whether you're ready for rain. It simply begins, first with the breeze, then the hush of the birds going still, then the scent, that damp, earthy inhale that arrives before the first drop. And when the rain finally comes, it does not come politely. It comes sideways, hammering leaves and slicing through the canopy and curtains. In the Amazon, there is no such thing as a gentle nighttime drizzle. There is only the storm and the response. So what does one do when caught between trees, wrapped in a hammock, and the sky opens up like a cracked bowl? You don't panic. That's the first rule. Sleep in the jungle is built not on comfort, but on anticipation. Before you ever lie down, you've already read the signs. You've chosen your trees close enough for shelter, strong enough to hold. You've felt the wind. You've smelled the rain in the soil, even before it's arrived. And most importantly, you've built a roof, not a house, not a tarp, though tarps are used in some places today, but a structure made from banana leaves, palm fronds, or woven bark strips. The design is simple, slanted, open on the sides, angled to guide the rain away from the sleeper. It's not perfect. It never is, but it turns a soaking night into a tolerable one. Some use 2 layers, an outer shield of fresh leaves, and an inner layer treated with tree resin or smoked over the fire to improve water resistance. The rain patters, slides, drips, but mostly misses the hammock beneath, and the hammock itself, raised higher than usual, tied tightly, and sagged just enough to hold warmth. The bottom may be lined with dried palm, the edges tightened against the body to form a cocoon if wind drives water in from the side. Sleepers will shift diagonally, tucking knees to chest, forming a bundle around their own warmth. One would think this makes for a miserable night, and sometimes it does, but more often, the opposite happens. People sleep well during storms, not because they enjoy being wet or cold, but because the rhythm of rain becomes a lullaby. The pounding of drops on the leaves, the distant rolls of thunder, the shush of wind in the upper branches. It creates a world that feels enclosed, softened, rhythmically alive. Many jungle tribes have lullabies modeled after rain, not in words, but in pace. The rise and fall of notes mimic the swell of a storm. Children are sung to sleep with voices that sound like dripping leaves, thunder far away, and the tapping of water on bark. And then there's the smell. After the storm, when the last raindrop has fallen and the leaves hang heavy with silence, the air is thick with petrichor and the scent of disturbed soil. This, for many, is the true sleep signal. The storm clears the world. The ants are quiet. The mosquitoes hide. The air is clean. Only then do the deepest sleeps happen, not during the storm, but just after, when everything holds its breath. There are stories, too, passed in low tones around firelit meals, of dreams that only come during storms. One tale speaks of the hammock whisperer, a forest spirit that visits sleepers who remain calm during the worst rain. If the sleeper does not flinch, does not stir, the spirit leaves a mark, a dream so vivid that the person wakes up remembering the color of the sky in it. Not metaphorically, literally, a new hue, seen only in sleep. These aren't common beliefs anymore. Even within the tribes, many shrug at the old legends. But the idea lingers that storms wash something open, that they make sleep more permeable, more available to the deep places where memories and dreams meet. In practical terms, storm sleep requires cooperation. One fire cannot be left alone. Someone must tend the embers, keep the smoke trails intact. Children are moved closer together. Mothers sleep lightly. Dogs curl tighter. The community shrinks into itself, forming what some call a sleep circle. Not a real circle, but a protective arrangement, like an invisible camp made of eyes and breath and quiet attentiveness. Even today, with solar lanterns and plastic sheets and rubber boots, the storm still wins, and the people still adapt. In one Yawanawá village, elders recently began experimenting with combining their traditional rain shelters with scavenged metal sheets from nearby towns. It's not seen as giving in to modernity, but as evolving the craft. Even the jaguar changes trails. One man joked, so why can't we change roofs? And yet, many still prefer the old method, the banana leaf roof, the hammock pitched high, the fire stacked with slow-burning wood, not out of nostalgia, but out of trust. They know it works. It has always worked. It is not the strongest structure, nor the driest, but it is sufficient. It cradles sleep, just enough to allow it to come, even with thunder nearby. There's something deeply human in this sleeping under a leaking leaf roof, wrapped in fiber, while lightning strikes somewhere beyond the trees. It's not safe, in the way concrete and locks feel safe, but it is real. It is responsive. You hear the storm, you feel the rain, and you sleep anyway. In a world obsessed with eliminating discomfort, this kind of sleep might seem primitive, but perhaps it's more advanced than we think. To sleep through a storm is not to ignore it. It is to trust your preparation, your instincts, your surroundings. So the final question hangs gently, like mist after rain. In a city sealed with windows, thermostats, and white noise machines, have we truly improved sleep? Or have we simply made it easier to forget what the night really sounds like? In the world's great history books, you'll read about gold, about silk, about spices. These things shimmer with importance, valuable, rare, and fought over by kings and merchants across oceans. But here, deep in the shaded corridors of the Amazon, trade once thrived not on brilliance, but on bark, quiet, brown, crumbling bark, bitter to taste, slow to collect, easy to overlook, and yet, in the 18th and 19th centuries, this unassuming forest scrap fueled one of the most quietly significant economic exchanges in South America. This is the story of how bark moved between sleeping hammocks and colonial ledgers, how trade happened slowly, on foot, with silence and endurance as its only real currencies. The bark in question is quina, from trees of the Cinchona genus, known for centuries to Andean peoples and eventually exported under colonial rule. Quina bark was valued for one key trait: its ability to reduce fevers, especially the bone-shaking fever of malaria, long before the disease had a name, long before quinine was isolated in a lab. People in the forest knew that chewing this bark or brewing it as tea could soothe the fire in the blood. But quina was not easy to obtain. It grew in the higher jungle regions, between the river basins and the mist-covered lower slopes of the Andes. It wasn't farmed in neat rows. It grew wild, scattered, shaded, with each tree offering different potencies. Some bark was strong, some was useless. There was no way to know without the bitter taste test. Enter the quiet collectors. These were not merchants or soldiers or city men. They were local laborers, often indigenous, sometimes mestizo, nearly always anonymous. They moved through the forest not in caravans, but in pairs or small bands, walking, sleeping in hammocks, chewing leaves, carrying nothing but knives, bundles of cloth, and the deep knowledge of where the good bark trees were. These collectors became experts not in medicine, but in stillness. Quina trees had to be approached gently. Bark stripped too quickly could ruin the tree. Trees harvested too often died. The good collectors rotated sites, taking only slivers, marking the trunks with subtle cuts or painted dots. They walked for weeks, sometimes months, and when they returned, their packs were heavy with curled bark and damp clothes and light on stories. Because, for the most part, this trade moved in whispers. There were no booming markets, no ships full of flags. The bark moved downriver in canoes, bundled in palm sacks, traded for salt, cloth, metal pots, or the rare colonial coin. And yet, despite the silence of the trade, its impact echoed far beyond the forest. By the late 1700s, colonial governments realized that malaria was threatening their plantations, their soldiers, their cities. Quina bark, especially when processed into quinine, was among the few known treatments, and so the demand grew, slowly at first, then urgently. The forest responded in the only way it knew how, by offering more bark, but on its own terms. You can't rush a tree. The quina trees took years to regrow usable bark. Collectors developed long mental maps of tree cycles. This one, rest until next dry season. That one, no good. Ants got it. The labor was methodical, tedious. There were no shortcuts. The forest would not be hurried. Interestingly, The bark trade influenced sleep patterns along the routes. Villages that served as waypoints began to adjust their rhythms. If collectors arrived near dusk, meals were served later. Fires were stoked longer. Hammocks were tied closer together. The night became a space not just for sleep, but for gentle barter. Sleep, in these villages, became communal, a mix of rest and quiet conversation, of stories traded with goods. It was not uncommon for collectors to arrive, hang their hammocks, and fall asleep mid-sentence. Exhausted from weeks in the interior, they would wake to bowls of fish broth, calabash water, and offers to exchange bark for simple tools. The expansion of the bark route reshaped these sleepy economies. Canoe builders began specializing in bark cargo. Women developed tighter weaving methods to keep the bark dry even in monsoon storms. Children played games involving bark bundles, practicing for a trade future. Bark, which had once been just another part of the tree, became the unspoken coin of survival. And yet, even at its peak, the trade remained quiet. No grand depots, no grand statues, just trails worn into the forest floor, hammock sites reused by travelers, trees marked by gentle hands, fires tended by people who knew that rest was part of the work. In some ways, this was history's most boring empire, built on sleep, bark, patience, and wet shoes. It raises a strange kind of question in a world where power usually comes loud and fast through conquest, cannon, or commerce. What happens when something small, bitter, and bark-colored changes the course of a continent? The canoes moved slowly. They had to, loaded with sacks of bark, often damp from the humidity, and packed as tight as smoke-cured bundles would allow. The boats rode low in the river. One sharp turn, one gust of wind, one misjudged eddy, and the entire payload could be lost to the dark brown current. These were not the grand sailing vessels of colonial conquest. No polished brass, no intricate navigation tools, just dugout canoes, shaped over weeks from single tree trunks, hollowed and widened by fire, scraped smooth with stone or metal tools, and guided by long paddles carved by hand. They carried no flags. Their crews did not sing songs. They didn't need to. The forest was loud enough. Each boat was its own economy. The quina bark trade had created something rare, a slow-moving supply chain designed by necessity. The collectors upstream needed cloth, salt, tools, or even rice items found only in the frontier towns or further on the coast. The towns needed quina bark for local remedies, or more often, for export contracts. The canoe traders sat in the middle, rarely talking, but always moving. These traders slept on the river. Hammocks were slung not in homes, but in the boats themselves. Sticks wedged across the canoe formed makeshift poles. Leaves were draped as tarps. Fires were banned aboard the boats, too risky with bark cargo, but fires were built at riverbanks, on sandbars, in still coves. Sleep came in 2-hour shifts. One man rested, while the other watched the water. The hum of insects and the slap of fish against the canoe became lullabies, not soothing ones, but familiar. It's worth noting that no part of this trade was urgent. The bark would not rot quickly. Buyers would wait. Prices were steady, predictable. Traders took their time because they could and because the forest offered no shortcuts. A fast paddle stroke tired the arms. A rushed loading tore the bark. A hasty route led to capsizing. The entire system favored the methodical. In this way, an economy grew not of speed, but of endurance. Along the routes, informal sleeping stations emerged. These were not inns or official rest stops, but familiar bends in the river, small clearings with flat ground and fire pits already ringed with stone. Some even had perches built into trees for hanging hammocks high enough to avoid snakes or ants. Traders recognized these places by instinct. They didn't need signs. The curve of the shoreline was enough. The rustle of the leaves told them if the place was still safe. At these stations, sleep was communal and brief. Traders from opposite directions might share a fire, sip river water together, swap bark samples, and then sleep without conversation. There was no need for stories. Everyone knew the story. It was etched in calloused feet and the slow ache of shoulders. The interesting part is that these routes and their rhythms existed outside official control. Colonial administrators occasionally tried to map the bark trade, to quantify and tax it, but the forest resisted measurement. Bark shipments vanished into trees. Collectors claimed to harvest less than they did. Traders moved when inspectors were absent. It was a ghost economy visible only at the endpoints, and yet it had structure. Collectors knew which traders paid in good salt. Traders knew which villages cheated on weight. Everyone knew who could be trusted to keep quiet. Reputation mattered. Bark was bitter, but a fair exchange could sweeten the whole route. One village, deep along a tributary rarely visited today, became known for its bark calendar. An elder there, a woman named Amaya, marked time not by seasons or stars, but by the sound of bark being split. She claimed she could tell the quality of bark by the crack it made when bent. Her home became a hub. Traders stopped just to let her hear their bundles. She rarely spoke, but her raised eyebrows were enough. It's said that for a full decade, no trader passed her village without stopping, even if only for a moment of judgment. And then there were the taxes, not official ones, but local customs. At some stops, traders were expected to leave behind a gift, not payment, but recognition. A few pinches of salt, a handful of dried fish, a new cord for a hammock. These were sleep taxes, exchanged in silence, left beside the fire pit or tied to a tree. No one kept track, but everyone remembered. This informal economy lasted surprisingly long, into the late 19th century, long after the rise of plantations and telegraph lines. The bark canoes still floated quietly along the rivers. They were bypassed by steamships, overshadowed by factories, but not erased. The slowness of their world was their strength. It made them invisible. And here lies the strange beauty of it all. An entire trade network, hundreds of kilometers long, driven not by schedules or contracts, but by rest, sleep, patience, habit, and trust. Could such a thing survive today? Could a supply chain operate without clocks, without spreadsheets, without urgency? Or is that kind of commerce only possible in a place where bark is more valuable than time? For centuries, the bark moved in silence, carried on backs, curled in canoes, exchanged in whispers, and then, almost without fanfare, it stopped, not all at once, not dramatically, but like the fading of a familiar trail in the forest, overgrown, forgotten, stepped around by newer feet. The quina bark trade, once so steady, so slow, so reliable, was undone, not by war or famine, but by laboratories. In the late 1800s, European chemists succeeded in isolating quinine in crystal form. No longer did doctors or pharmacists need to chew bitter strips of bark or boil wood into unpredictable tonics. A precise dosage, white and glinting, could now be administered in cities far from any jungle. The need for raw bark declined, and with it, the sleepy rhythm of its collection. Governments, eager to control supply and standardize output, turned to plantations. In Java, British and Dutch colonial forces began cultivating cinchona trees en masse, far from their South American origin. These plantations could be managed, monitored, taxed. The wild forest could not. Back in the Amazon, bark collectors began to disappear, not physically, but culturally. Their skills, once prized, became quaint. Their trails faded. The bark trees they had tended for decades, marked with gentle cuts and mental notes, stood untouched. In some areas, the trees grew thick again. In others, they were felled for rubber or pasture. A few collectors resisted the change. They continued their rounds, harvested bark as before, but found fewer buyers. Some stored their bundles in huts, hoping prices would return. Others adapted shifting to rubber tapping or Brazil nut collection. But the days of bark for salt, of silent sleeping stations, of fire-warmed bundles traded by moonlight, those days were gone. The forest didn't mourn. It never does. But the rhythm changed. In one village, an elder named Davy kept his bark tools in a folded palm box beneath his hammock. A rusty knife, a cloth bundle with faded paint, a small scrap of paper bearing the name of a Portuguese trader long gone. He told visitors, if they asked, about the time when bark was more valuable than meat, when traders napped in rows, tied hammocks between canoes and trees, sharing dreams instead of contracts. We used to say, he whispered once, that you could hear a man's honesty by the way he packed bark. Too tight, and he was hiding rot. Too loose, and he was lazy, but just right. That man you could sleep beside. What remained wasn't the economy, it was the habit. Long after the bark trade died, people still slept along the river in the same places. The rest stations remained, even if the traders didn't. Fires were built where they had always been. Children were taught to tie hammocks between the same trees. Sleep, it seemed, had outlived the commerce that once depended on it. Today, if you drift slowly along certain Amazonian rivers, you might still spot the signs, not maps or monuments, but subtler clues, a notch in a tree, carved long ago to hang a pot, a patch of flat ground, oddly clear in the undergrowth, a stretch of shoreline that just feels still. These are the remnants of the bark empire, not ruins. Exactly. Just memories stored in the soil, in the way the forest leans over the water, as if remembering the weight of canoes drifting past. There is something oddly comforting about it, that a trade route could exist for so long without ever needing a road, that people could survive not by conquering or consuming, but by walking slowly, sleeping deeply, and taking only as much bark as the forest could offer. In the modern world, with its precision logistics and 24-hour delivery systems, it's hard to imagine such a trade lasting even a year. It was inefficient, vulnerable, and yet it endured because it was quiet, because it was patient, because it let people sleep. And so, the final thought drifts in like river mist at dawn. What if the most sustainable economy is the one that allows you to nap under trees you planted, near fires you built, surrounded by people who never had to raise their voices. There are many ways to choose a leader. You can count votes, follow bloodlines, or watch who commands a room. You can select the loudest, the richest, the cleverest, or, in some places, simply the oldest. But in certain Amazonian communities, leadership followed a quieter path, one woven between trees and wrapped in sleeping cloth. Among the Tucano people of the upper Rio Negro region, and in a scattering of smaller neighboring groups, authority wasn't something you took, it was something you earned by waiting and sleeping, specifically by sleeping last. The role of a leader or paye in some traditions was not bestowed lightly. It wasn't about charisma or dominance. It was about endurance, patience, listening, and most curiously, the ability to remain awake long after others had drifted off. In the evenings, after meals had ended and the fires had shrunk to soft embers, the hammocks would sway with the breath of sleep. Children first, curled like vines in their slings, then mothers, then the young men, until even the dogs had tucked their noses beneath their tails. But one person stayed awake, the leader, not out of insomnia, not because they were burdened, but because this was part of the role, to sit, to think, to watch the dark. Their hammock would be strung, yes, but often left untouched, swaying empty under the moonlight. To be the last sleeper was to carry the group's uncertainties into the night, not to solve them, necessarily, but to hold them until morning. This behavior was never announced. No one pointed to the leader and said, "Look, they are still awake." It was simply known. Children noticed, adults whispered. Respect was not taught, it was observed. The paye's hammock would hang slightly apart from the others, often near the edge of the maloca, the communal longhouse, not as a throne, but as a listening post. There, the night noises were clearest, the cough of a monkey, the distant flap of a heron, the hiss of wind in the palm thatch. It was said that a true leader could identify a visitor by footstep alone, just from the way the ground changed beneath them, and this vigilance had a sleep logic all its own. The leader did sleep, eventually, but lightly. In short segments, they would often rise before the firekeepers, sometimes even before the birds. The ideal leader was one whose rest came second to the needs of the group, but whose fatigue never showed. There were stories never quite confirmed of candidates for leadership who failed this unspoken test. One slept through a storm and missed the sound of a falling tree near the garden. Another it fell into such a deep nap that he snored, waking a nursing child and causing murmured complaints. These incidents were not punished, but they were remembered, and when the time came to choose a guide, those names quietly fell away. Instead, the chosen ones were those whose sleep patterns became mirrors of the village's needs. When sickness spread, they slept nearer the ill. When outsiders arrived, they moved their hammocks to the entry side of the longhouse. When a disagreement brewed, they shifted closer to the involved parties, not to intervene, but to be present, should the moment require a word. Their power lay not in declarations, but in adjustments. Hammocks, after all, are not stationary. They are mobile, flexible, reflective of mood. Where a leader chose to hang theirs mattered. Height could indicate confidence or withdrawal. Orientation could suggest alliance or quiet resistance. A leader who subtly shifted their hammock to match a troubled elder's position was performing a kind of diplomacy without words. Even the materials mattered. Leaders were expected to maintain their hammocks in good repair, never show frayed cords or sagging fabric. A slack hammock might imply inattentiveness, too tight, and one risked looking rigid. The balance was both practical and symbolic. Your sleeping posture revealed your leadership posture. And of course, silence was key. The leader rarely gave long speeches. When disputes arose, they listened first, sometimes for days. A solution might come during a forest walk or while peeling manioc at dusk. When the leader did speak, it was often while resting in the hammock, mid-sway, words delivered in low tones, punctuated by creaking cord and crackling fire. This sleep-centric leadership was not universal, but it was deeply rooted in certain regions, and it wasn't confined to men. In some groups, elder women especially, midwives or herbalists, held equal authority. They, too, were judged by their rest, how they napped after delivering a child, how quickly they rose to check on a fever, how quietly they shifted through the night. Power, in this context, had nothing to do with dominance. It was about reliability in rest, a leader who could remain calm while others trembled, a presence that soothed, not stirred, someone who did not react, but responded. It raises a strange idea for our modern world. Could leadership be measured not by bold action, but by the stillness between them, not by how loudly someone speaks, but by how quietly they listen, especially when everyone else has already gone to sleep? By day, the Amazonian longhouse, known in many groups as the Maloca, was a hive of movement, grinding manioc, feeding dogs, cleaning fish, shaping paddles, braiding cords. But by night, it became a different structure entirely, a map of social order drawn in swinging hammocks and flickering light. In the absence of walls or offices, the Maloca organized itself through subtle signals: who slept where, how high, how angled. Leadership was neither announced nor marked by costume. It was woven into the space, into the rhythm of sleep. Imagine walking into such a space as night falls. The floor is packed earth, cool and firm. Fires smolder low. Shadows of hammocks sway along the walls like vines, and along the edges, just slightly set apart, you notice a pattern. The leader's hammock is always easy to find, not by ornamentation, but by context. It hangs just far enough from the central fire to suggest independence, but not so far that its occupant is disconnected. It is the access point, the place from which quiet observations radiate. In many communities, the leader's hammock faced inward. This allowed them to see the entire community from their resting place, not in a panopticon sense, but more like a parent watching over a sleeping house. From this angle, even the subtlest disturbances, an anxious toss, a cough, a child waking in fright, could be noticed. Others mirrored the leader's orientation. When a leader adjusted their hammock to face a different direction, say, toward the door or toward a specific family, it sent a clear, though wordless, message. In this way, the very act of how and where one slept became a form of policy. Hammocks at higher tension, tied taut between poles, suggested alertness. Looser, lower ones implied restfulness or withdrawal. And then there was height. Hammocks tied higher off the ground indicated status, or at the very least, respect. This wasn't vanity, it was utility. Higher hammocks avoided insects, allowed better airflow, and offered a clearer view of the fire circle. Leaders often trained themselves to swing gently, to signal wakefulness without standing. There were customs, too, about what could surround a leader's hammock. Children were not supposed to tie their slings too close. Dogs were gently nudged to other areas. And though the leader might accept gifts, bundles of tobacco, strings of dried fish, these were left beside the post or fire pit, never placed directly in the hammock. That space was personal, but also communal. Everyone could see it, but no one intruded. In some tribes, particularly among the Tariano, when two leadership candidates were being considered, they would hang their hammocks opposite each other for a season. Their every move, how they greeted guests, how they reacted to babies crying, how they managed their sleep, would be quietly observed. There were no debates, no tests, only time, firelight, and the weight of habit. Leadership was revealed through posture. One posture in particular was deeply admired: the half sit, when the leader would rest in the hammock, knees drawn, not quite lying down, not quite awake. This pose suggested readiness, calm but available, relaxed but watching. It communicated the most valued trait of all: not needing to act unless absolutely necessary. At ceremonial gatherings, the leader's hammock became a kind of stage, but not in the way of speeches. Rather, they would lie still and let others approach. Disputes were brought like offerings. Two people might sit at the foot of the hammock and begin to speak in low tones. The leader listened, not interrupting, not reacting. After a long silence, perhaps a nod or a short phrase, resolution, when it came, was often no longer than a few heartbeats. People left such encounters not feeling judged, but witnessed. In this way, the hammock became the ultimate symbol of power, not because it lifted one off the ground, but because it offered rest without retreat. The leader was always there, not up late shouting orders, not locked away writing plans, but gently swinging, surrounded by breath, heat, and human need. There's a story still told among some older communities, one that may or may not be true, but lives in the telling. It goes like this: a young man, eager to be seen as a future leader, built the finest hammock the village had ever seen, dyed with rare seeds, strung from polished hardwoods, hung high with ceremonial knots. The people came and admired it. He tied it at the highest post in the longhouse and lay there for a full day, waiting to be praised. That night, an old woman with worn feet and an older hammock tied hers beside the smallest fire, near the doorway where the cold blew in. She slept there every night. She woke when others coughed. She fed a child whose mother had no milk. She fixed a cord. She sang. In the end, it was her name that the elders spoke. The young man's hammock still hangs perfect, untouched. The message is simple and deeply boring. Real leadership is not built in daylight. It is measured in sleep. So one might ask, in today's world of corner offices and podiums, what would it mean to lead from a hammock? To show strength, not by how loudly you speak, but by how still you are when others can finally rest. Not all leaders slept, at least not in the usual sense. Among some Amazonian groups, especially those living in regions prone to intertribal tension or seasonal migration, certain leaders were known not just for their calm, but for their intentional lack of rest. These were the watchers, elders or guides who treated sleep as a ritual of vigilance. They were not restless. They were patient. They slept less so others could sleep more. And yet, in their wakefulness, they cultivated something unexpected: stillness as power. These leaders understood that in the deep jungle, silence carried more weight than words. A misplaced warning could start a feud. A bad dream told aloud could stir panic. Even a cough, spoken at the wrong moment, could ripple through a community like a dropped stone in still water. So they withheld. They waited. When the village slept children in their hammocks, hunters curled like commas, the fire breathing gently. These sleepless ones sat at the edges, not pacing or prowling, but merely being present, a silhouette by the wall, a flicker behind the coals. The knowledge that someone was still listening gave the community permission to rest fully, and that was the point. These leaders weren't sacrificing sleep for drama or martyrdom. They weren't trying to prove a point. They understood deeply that true leadership was invisible when it worked. Over time, this tradition took on deeper meaning. In some communities, elders began referring to these sleepless leaders as palm shade people, those who didn't cast shadows of their own, but provided shelter so others could stretch out theirs. Like the leaves of the tallest palms, they covered without touching. They were there without announcing it. One story from the middle. Rio Tikie tells of a woman named Ilara, a respected midwife and quiet leader. She wasn't elected. She wasn't even the oldest in her household. But every time someone went into labor, she was already awake, already boiling water, already at the right side of the Maloka. Her hammock hung low, nearly touching the ground, and yet no one ever saw her truly asleep. It's said she once went 3 days without closing her eyes, during a time of sickness, helping nurse the village through waves of fever. When others insisted she rest, she only smiled. "I do," she said. When you do, there were no monuments to Ilara, but after her death, her hammock remained tied for a full season, not out of superstition, but respect. People said it's still remembered. And this idea of the remembering hammock became a form of cultural memory. Even today, in longhouses where modern life has brought radios, flashlights, and weatherproof tarps, there are still spaces set aside for certain people, spaces not claimed, not decorated, just known. A hook left free, a nail never removed, the echo of a posture long vanished. You see, these leaders didn't just influence how people slept, they shaped how rest itself was understood. Their approach taught that rest was not weakness, that to listen quietly all night was not idleness, but strength. That power did not always move forward. It could hover, drift, settle like a mosquito net, unseen until needed. And in a time when outside pressures from governments, missionaries, and market economies threatened to upend traditional ways, these principles endured, not because they were defended loudly, but because they were woven into habit. You can still see it in some of the elders today. They do not rush to answer. They shift in their hammocks. They look toward the doorway before they speak. They keep their fire low, their tools close, and their sleep light, because a good leader, in the forest's eyes, is not one who knows everything. It is the one whose presence makes others sleep better. So what can we take from this now, far from the forest, in a world full of urgency? Perhaps it is this: that real power is not in staying awake longer to work harder, but in watching the night not to control it, but to make space for someone else to finally rest. That maybe, just maybe, Leadership isn't about what you say when everyone's looking. But what kind of stillness you keep when no one is. In much of the world, time is a matter of numbers, seconds ticking past, alarms buzzing, calendars dotted with appointments. But for generations of forest dwelling peoples in the Amazon, time was not something counted. It was something felt. It was in the tilt of a leaf, the rhythm of a bird's call, the thickness of the air just before the rains arrived, and most of all, in the rain itself. This is the story of the rain calendar, a system not written down, but remembered through skin, smoke, and sleep. A calendar kept not in books, but in habits, and while no historian ever drew it on a chart, its influence stretched across planting, harvesting, trading, and even dreaming. The Tukuna, the Marubo, and many others like them did not divide the year into 12 parts. Instead, they recognized a cycle of moments periods marked by specific qualities of rain, early mists, midday bursts, long downpours, silent drizzle that soaked through hammocks without a sound. Each kind of rain was a signal, a messenger. It told them what to expect and when to rest. The first rains of the season were known by some groups as the stirrings, not dramatic storms, but hesitant showers, falling mostly at dusk. These rains didn't soak the forest. They tapped it awake. Old leaves fell in sudden showers. Insects emerged in higher numbers. The humidity changed its flavor. You knew this rain not because it was heavy, but because it came with a scent earthy, green, with a hint of fermentation. It was the forest exhaling. This was the time when hammocks were moved to new positions. Sleeping arrangements shifted. The high hammocks came down, lower ones went up, not for comfort, but for airflow. The community adapted as a whole, changing posture in sync with the weather. Then came the second season, the listening rains. These came in the early night short, sudden, loud. You'd be halfway into sleep when the sky split open, rattling leaves and flinging water against the thatch. But these storms passed quickly. They were tests, almost warnings. The elders listened carefully to the angle of the rain. A sideways rain meant a change in wind pattern. A straight fall meant good hunting weather would follow. Children were taught not to speak during these first rains, not out of fear, but out of tradition. The clouds are speaking. They were told, let them finish. Hammocks would sway in total silence while water drummed against the roof. The rain calendar was not just about timing, it was about respect. Later came the sleeping rains, long, soft, consistent downpours that lasted from late night into morning. These were the rains that slowed everything down. Fishing halted, tools were stored, gardens waited, people slept longer. Dreams were said to be stronger during these rains, more vivid, more fragrant, more accurate. During this season, people often napped twice in one day, once in the afternoon, once again before evening meals. This wasn't laziness, it was balance. The body moved with the sky. Energy followed water. Many Moluccas adjusted their architecture in this season. Roofs were thickened with new leaves. Fires were moved closer to hammocks. The smoke became more than a shield. It was a clock. As it rose and fell, you knew how deep into the storm you were. Then came the shifting rains, erratic bursts that made no promises. Some fell at noon, others after midnight. Sometimes they vanished for days. These were unsettling times. Arguments were more frequent. Crops grew unpredictably. People tied their hammocks tighter and carried leaf cloaks even in sunlight. In these moments, the forest seemed unsure of itself, and finally, the closing rains soft, warm, heavy rains that felt like farewells. They signaled the end of the wet cycle. The rivers would shrink, the paths hardened underfoot. The forest began to hum differently higher, drier, sharper. This was the time of preparation. Seeds were sorted, fishing lines checked, bark for sleeping mats was gathered and cured, and people began to sleep outside again, under trees, without shelter, testing the calm. The full rain calendar was rarely spoken of directly. There were no lectures or lessons. A child learned it by waking up damp and being told, "Ah, this is a listening morning," or by seeing their grandmother adjust the hammock angle, muttering, "Too much headwind. It's shifting again." Over time, these fragments formed a full understanding. One of the most telling aspects of this system was that it repeated without precision. No 2 years were alike. Some rains arrived early, others overstayed, but the people adjusted not by changing the calendar, but by changing themselves, and sleep played a central role. The timing, length, and placement of sleep told you what part of the cycle you were in. A long nap beside the garden, closing rains, a restless night with winds tugging the roof, listening season, a midday doze that turned into full slumber, uninterrupted, sleeping rains, without a doubt. In the Western world, time is vertical. It stacks, marches, ascends. In the forest, it flows, it curves with rivers, and curls into leaf patterns. The rain calendar didn't organize life, it mirrored it. Sleep was not scheduled, it was invited. So here's a gentle question to close on. What would it feel like to sleep? Not when your watch tells you, but when the clouds say it's time. In the forest, no one wears a wristwatch. Time is not wrapped around your wrist. It clings to your ankles, slips into your hammock, and smells faintly of wet bark. As the rain calendar progresses, people stop thinking in days or dates. Instead, they think in textures. How wet was the ground this morning? Did the fire start easily? Was the hammock rope stiff or soft when I untied it? These small, tactile details mark time as clearly as any clock, and over generations, they've created a quiet kind of scheduling, one rooted not in certainty, but in readiness. In the middle of the sleeping rains, when nights are long and consistent, most forest dwellers wake slowly. There is no rush. The jungle breathes in steam, and the canopy drips with yesterday's thoughts. Hammocks remain occupied well past sunrise, not from laziness, but from respect for the body, for the sky, for the rhythm of damp earth. This is also when the dreams arrive, not necessarily bigger or stranger, but stickier. People remember them longer, more details, more scent. In one riverside village, elders insist that the best dreams, those carrying warnings, guidance, or ideas come during this soggy season, not because of spirits or visions, but because the body, finally still, listens longer. These dreams are not interpreted like riddles. There is no dream priest. Instead, they are shared around fire circles, unwrapped gently like bundles of food. Someone might say, "I dreamed of fish in the garden path," and the listeners nod. No reply is needed, just recognition. And if a dream comes with a clear instruction, build the fence higher, wait one more week to plant, avoid that trail, then the community listens. Not because the dream is law, but because the rain gave it. Rain dreams are considered different from dry dreams. The latter are scattered, jumpy, full of noise. Rain dreams flow. They begin slowly, drift through memory, and often carry an emotion more than an event, a sense of longing, of movement, of change. They don't need interpretation. They just settle into the body. During this time, hammocks are hung closer together, not for warmth, but for reassurance. The jungle seems louder during constant rain, not in sound, but in density. You feel more watched, more enclosed. So the hammocks form their own quiet village within the longhouse. People sway to sleep not in solitude, but in rhythm with others. Children are often rocked extra long before bed during this season. The rocking is not a lullaby, it's a memory cue, a way to tell the body this is what stillness feels like again. Because during the dry season, stillness is rare. But when the rain returns, sleep regains its power. It becomes a teacher. Outside, the forest becomes unreadable. Trails vanish in puddles. Tree roots swell. Ants relocate. Even the riverbanks shift. But inside the Maloka, time becomes easier, more intuitive. When the second pot of broth is stirred, it's probably mid-morning. When the hammocks stop swaying, it's close to dusk. Some groups even use smoke trails to track the day. In dry months, smoke rises sharply, almost vertical. But in heavy rain seasons, it clings low, dragging sideways, like a tired thought. One elder, grinning through 3 missing teeth, once said, "When smoke walks like an old man, it's time for planting yams." Others pay attention to how quickly the fire blackens the pot. More steam, less flame. Then the air is thick better. Wait another week to travel. This seasonal awareness reaches every part of life. Fishing techniques change. Cooking shifts to slower stews. Hammock cords are re-oiled with tree sap. Even storytelling styles change. In dry months, tales are sharp and clever. In rainy times, they're slower, meandering. Like rain itself, visitors often fail to adjust. Missionaries, traders, or researchers arrive with notebooks and questions, asking for schedules. When do you begin harvest? What's the date of the next ceremony? How long is the rest period? The villagers smile, not out of politeness, but patience. The answers are in the wind, in the thickness of the leaf, in the way the birds sing before dawn. When the rain changes, they say, "We will know," and sleep. During this season is the deepest marker of all. In the listening rains, people woke often, stirred, listened, but during the sleeping rains, they truly slept. Whole families might remain in hammocks until midday. If someone was restless, others took notice. Their spirit is not settled yet. They'd say, "Let the rain work on them." A few communities have a word for this untranslatable but evocative, roughly, to be softened by water while unconscious. It's a compliment. Actually, a sign that you are in tune with the season, that your body has remembered how to rest. No alarm clock can offer that. So the question lingers, as slow as a morning drizzle on palm thatch. What kind of calendar would we follow if we based it not on productivity, but on how well we sleep when it rains? There comes a day, usually in the early morning, when you realize something's missing. It's not obvious at first. The fire still smolders. The birds still sing. But something has shifted. You step out of your hammock and notice the air feels lighter. The ground no longer clings to your ankles. The pot boils faster. The firewood, which had been smoking sluggishly for weeks, finally catches a proper flame. The rain has stopped. Not forever. Not absolutely. But the sleeping rains have passed, and with their passing, a different kind of time begins. Among many forest communities, this moment marks the start of the dry rhythm, not a season. Exactly, because no one draws lines between months, but a noticeable shift in tempo. The days lengthen, the nights get louder. Sleep, once deep and lingering, becomes lighter again. Dreams flicker instead of flowing. People wake earlier. Hammocks swing a little more. This is when the forest holds its breath. In the absence of constant rain, everything begins to listen again. Steps are louder, insects more aggressive. The heat presses in, and yet, despite the discomfort, there's a kind of excitement. The planting season begins. Fishing expeditions stretch longer. Old trails reappear. Canoes are patched, axes rewrapped, seeds sorted, but no one forgets the rain. One of the final rituals in the rain calendar is what some communities call the remembering nap. It is not formal. It does not require chanting or smoke. It simply happens, unannounced, on a dry afternoon, just as the rains have fully ended. People retreat for a midday sleep alone, or in pairs, or as families. No one talks during this nap. It is not about dreaming. It is about keeping something. You lie in your hammock and let your body remember what it felt like to sleep in rain-soaked rhythm. The muscle memory of slow breath, of dripping leaf lullabies, of stillness so deep you forgot to think. It is a kind of gratitude nap, a quiet thank you to the cycle that has passed. Children are sometimes told, if you don't take the remembering nap, the next rain won't find you. It's not a threat, just a saying, a reminder that time, like water, requires participation. After this nap, life accelerates. Tools are noisier. Games return. People speak more quickly, laugh more often. It is not better or worse, just different. But even in this busier time, there remain echoes of the calendar past. Cooking fires are still built with the timing of the rain in mind. Traders wait for clear patterns before making journeys. Gardeners plant by watching the clouds, not the calendar. And most importantly, sleep remains shaped by the cycle because the forest has taught again and again that rest is not an interruption of work. It is part of the work. Even now, in villages where plastic tarps cover roofs and digital watches hang from pegs, people still comment on sleep with seasonal awareness. A mother might murmur, "He sleeps like a first rain," when her child is calm and dreamy, or "My dreams were full of wet leaves again," as a sign that the body is remembering. One elder, now too old to fish or walk long distances, still keeps a string of marked seeds, each one tied with a bit of bark or feather. He calls it his rain necklace, and though it serves no official function, he fingers it every evening before sleep. This one, he says, reminds me of the long rain in '83. We slept for 3 days straight. And perhaps that's the truest measure of time. Not a schedule, not a number, but a memory of rest. In modern life, we track everything: steps, sleep cycles, heartbeats, productivity. But how often do we mark time by the quality of a nap, by the scent of smoke during a storm, by the sound of dripping water remembered from a dream? So the rain calendar ends not with a final date, but with a question. When the clouds no longer speak and the forest quiets, what do you carry forward? A tighter hammock knot, a habit of pausing before sleep, or simply the knowledge that time isn't always something to chase. Sometimes it's something to lie back into. In a place as overwhelmingly green as the Amazon, color becomes currency, not in coins, not in paper, but in feathers bright, rare, fragile things that flash between trees and disappear just as quickly. Blue that hurts the eye, red so vivid it seems painted, yellow that glows even in the dim under canopy. These feathers didn't just decorate headdresses or fans, they were trade goods, social signals, and ceremonial tools. They moved through the forest slowly, hand to hand, wrapped in leaf bundles or tucked inside baskets. And more curiously, they shaped not just ritual life, but how, where, and when people slept. This is the story of the feather economies, those quiet, careful systems built around the gathering, gifting, and guarding of color. Systems that, while often overlooked by colonial traders, held enormous power among forest societies. The most prized feathers often came from birds not easily hunted. The scarlet macaw, for instance, whose long red tail feathers were used in everything from dance fans to negotiation bundles, was not simply shot down on sight. Instead, they were often raised, yes, raised, among several indigenous groups, including the Kayapo and the Yawanawá. Households would take in young macaws, hand-fed and cared for in open-air enclosures. The birds were not pets in the Western sense, nor livestock. They were considered relatives of color, beings that offered their feathers the way trees offered bark. When the molting season came, the birds would shed, and the family would collect. If more feathers were needed for a ceremony, a small, careful pluck might be done, but always with murmurs, always with thanks, never more than a few. Feathers, unlike meat or fish, couldn't be stored easily. They required maintenance. They curled in humidity, faded in sunlight. Mice and insects chewed them. As such, households often assigned a special hammock, not for people, but for the feather basket, suspended from the beams, wrapped in cloth, kept above smoke to repel pests. This hammock was usually located near the sleeping quarters of elders or craftswomen. Why? Because the feathers had to be watched over, protected, not from theft, but from neglect. Sleep played a part here, too. The caretaker of the feathers was expected to wake gently if the fire dropped too low, or if the smoke shifted. Some families swore they could smell when the feathers were unhappy, too damp, too close to fire, not wrapped properly. In these households, sleep was punctuated, not just a rest, but a cycle of small, wakeful moments, checking the fire, turning the basket, adjusting the hammock ropes so the feather scent didn't attract moths. Collectors, on the other hand, slept differently. To collect wild feathers from birds, not raised but hunted, was exhausting work. It required stealth, long treks, and most critically, timing. Certain birds only moved at dawn or dusk. Others nested high in cliffs or deep in forest pockets. Hunters would leave at twilight and sleep on elevated platforms miles from the village, slung between trees known to attract parrots. These were not restful nights. Sleep came in fragments, ears alert for wing beats or branch creaks, and yet, even in this tension, there was beauty. Some collectors described a dreamlike state, half asleep, half waiting, where the sounds of the birds and the rhythms of the forest became indistinguishable from their own breath, a kind of synchronization with the forest's heartbeat. When a rare feather was obtained, especially from birds like the harpy eagle or the king vulture, it was not brought back triumphantly. It was carried silently, wrapped in cloth, sometimes layered with herbs or tree oils to preserve it. Upon return, the feather might not be used immediately. Instead, it was stored above the family's sleeping area, sometimes for months, until the right moment arrived. Feathers held potential, not immediate value, like sleep. Their worth was tied to timing, context, and care. In trade, feathers moved through hands like messages. A single tail feather could be exchanged for food, tools, or marriage favors, but only if it was pristine. Bent feathers were considered unlucky, dull ones, disrespectful. To offer a feather that hadn't been properly stored was to insult the receiver, hence the importance of the feather sleepers, those who tended the baskets, adjusted the smoke, and kept the bundle dry during the endless rainy nights. One elder woman, known only as Maruwa, once claimed she hadn't slept a full night in 30 years, but my feathers, she said, have never curled. There is something delicate about this form of economy. It relies not on force, not even on need, but on trust and slowness. Feathers, like dreams, cannot be rushed. They arrive when they will, and if mishandled, they disappear. So perhaps the feather economies teach us something strange and gentle. That beauty can be a form of wealth, that color can be currency, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is sleep lightly near the basket and keep the smoke just right. If you think of feathers only as decoration, you miss the point. In the forest, they were statements, not shouted declarations, but quiet markers of lineage, generosity, and timing. To wear the right feather at the right event could secure an alliance, mark a family's prestige, or signal a coming negotiation. And these meanings weren't static, they were built over time, layer by layer, through care, through trade, and yes, through sleep. Among the Kayapo, for instance, wearing a full fan of scarlet macaw tail feathers wasn't about showmanship, it was a biography. Each feather had been traded for, gifted, or inherited. No two came from the same moment. One might represent a daughter's naming, another a successful hunting trip. A third most prized might come from a bird raised by a grandmother long since passed. To assemble such a fan wasn't quick work. It required decades and storage. The most powerful households often had not the most feathers, but the most feather hammocks. These were not for people. They were narrower, with shallower dips, strung lower in the smoke lines. Each held bundles of feathers, wrapped and counter-wrapped, rotated through cycles of heat and cool air to prevent brittleness. The person who tended these hammocks was rarely a warrior or trader. More often, it was a widow or an elder daughter, someone trusted with the daily rhythms of tending, pulling down bundles before the rain started, rewrapping them after, testing each with fingertips for signs of curl or softness. These caretakers often slept near the bundles, not for convenience, but for continuity. If a feather was damaged during the night, it was considered bad luck, not because of the feather itself, but because it indicated the household had stopped listening. And so, the caretakers slept lightly. Their sleep cycles often aligned with the fire's rhythm. They would wake when the flames dimmed too much and toss on a sliver of wood, keeping the smoke soft and constant, not for warmth, not for cooking, but for the feathers. Visitors to these homes might comment on the scent wood, oil, and something sharper, almost floral. This was urucum, a reddish dye from annatto seeds, used to brighten feathers and also to protect them from insects. It clung to skin, to hammocks, even to dreams. Dreams, in fact, were said to be affected by feathers. Some said sleeping beneath a certain color brought visions. Red feathers brought passion dreams. Blue feathers brought remembering. Yellow, rare, and fleeting was said to spark a kind of clarity. Of course, no one wrote this down. It was just something known, passed through murmurs, like most things of value in the forest. In one community, a rite of passage for adolescent boys involved sleeping under a fan of feathers for 7 nights. Each night, they were to remember their dreams and share only one word upon waking. The elders listened for patterns, not meaning necessarily, but tone. Was the word soft, sharp, hesitant? Over time, these words formed a kind of character sketch, a quiet introduction to the adult world. Feathers also played a role in diplomacy. Intense negotiations between tribes. Envoys might arrive not with weapons or arguments, but with a feather mat laid out in the center of the longhouse, each feather placed in order of trade history. These mats told stories of who gave what, when, and under what sky. If a feather had curled or faded, the implied meaning was loss of respect. If it remained bright, the relationship was considered intact. Maintaining that brightness, therefore, was political, and sleep played a hidden part, because a well-kept feather wasn't just a beautiful object. It was proof of care. It meant someone had slept beneath it for nights on end, checking the smoke, listening for rats, shifting the bundle slightly with the weather. It was proof that someone hadn't let down their guard. And in a world where conflict could begin with a single broken expectation, such quiet effort was more valuable than any speech. Even among rival groups, stories spread of legendary feather keepers. One woman, they said, could sleep in absolute stillness, never turning in her hammock, so as not to disturb the balance of her feather mat. Another man was said to hum as he slept just softly enough to keep the moths at bay. Were these stories true? Perhaps not. But like the feathers themselves, the stories were delicate truths, fragile, bright, and passed along with care. The feather economies were never fast. They couldn't be. A single bird might only offer good plumes once a year. A well-tended bundle might last a decade if no one spilled water, if no spark reached it, if no child grabbed too eagerly. And so, people adjusted. They stored color like others stored grain. They traded dreams like others traded goods. And they slept lightly, quietly, always just beneath the sway of something irreplaceable, which makes you wonder, what would it mean if our treasures today, our status, our proof of worth, had to be protected through decades of careful sleep, not locked in a vault, but carried gently through the night, watched over by smoke and moonlight? The feather economies, like so many delicate systems, didn't survive the full weight of outside pressure. They were too slow, too subtle, too connected to the rhythms of the forest itself. When European colonizers began to establish their presence in the Amazon during the 18th century, feathers caught their attention not for their symbolic value, but for their material worth. Exotic colors, rare birds, the chance to profit from the aesthetic demand in European courts, all of it became entangled with the local trade. As demand grew, so did exploitation. Traders began to see feathers not as sacred items that had stories, seasons, and histories, but as products to be harvested like crops. Birds that had once been carefully nurtured in their own spaces were hunted more aggressively. Trees, once sacred to certain feather keepers, were cut down. Even feather caretakers were brought into westernized systems of labor, no longer seen as guardians, but as workers in a supply chain. What followed was a quiet unraveling. Some elders, who had once guarded the feathers with pride, began to see fewer of them. The macaws stopped coming to certain regions. The special birds disappeared to places no one could follow. The birds that remained were tamed and kept in captivity, forced to live on the ground rather than high in the canopy where their feathers had flourished. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't even dramatic, but slowly. The feather-based systems of trade and power became unsustainable, and sleep, once centered around the careful protection of these fragile objects, began to shift as well. The communal rhythms of the feather guardians, those quiet nights, those careful check-ins slowed, then stopped. People no longer needed to wake at odd hours or sleep near the delicate baskets because the feathers were no longer there to watch over. The full impact of this change is hard to measure. Did the quality of sleep change when feathers disappeared, or did it merely take on a different rhythm, one less bound to the forest's pulse? What we do know is that without the care of feathers, sleep became less shared and more personal. As feathers left the forest, so did a kind of connectedness. No longer did people sleep in proximity to these vibrant symbols of interdependence. No longer did children grow up beneath the dim glow of feathers wrapped in cloth, passed from one generation to the next. The cultural practices around feathers' stories, gifts, rituals faded, or at least were forced underground. Yet, like the memory of a dream, the concept of careful sleep did not disappear. In some small communities, people continued to hang their hammocks as they had before, just slightly apart from one another. They still felt the weight of the past, even as they adjusted to the modern world that moved faster, demanded more, and kept its own rhythm. Feathers became relics, stored in museums or tucked into old drawers. Some were kept as treasures, while others were forgotten. But in their absence, a kind of deep silence entered the forest and the villages. Without the guiding presence of feathers, people relied more on other markers, fewer shared objects, but more shared knowledge. A sigh in the wind, a change in the bird songs, the way the soil felt underfoot after a night of rain. In modern times, when people still visit these villages, they often ask about the feathers. Where are they? What happened to the trade? They inquire. The answer is soft, quiet, as though the answer is known without needing to be spoken aloud. Feathers were never about possession. The elders explain. They were about presence, the quiet recognition of something valuable that could not be hurried or taken by force. They still exist in memory, in stories shared by firelight. Feathers will always exist in the breath of the forest, carried by wind, by rain, by memory. And as for sleep, well, it too is a kind of feather, perhaps not as bright, perhaps not as rare, but still fragile, still sacred, still deserving of careful care. So perhaps we too should learn to listen closely to the shifts in the air, to notice the small movements, to feel the weight of what we carry in the quiet hours. Because even in the absence of feathers, sleep remains a gift we still hold, wrapped softly in the night.